Our notes today are the second part of our look at the American Revolution, and kind of the two major topics we're going to discuss are the Battle of Saratoga, a really crucial battle. We've got to understand what goes on there because that is really what turns the tide of the war. And then also we're going to take a look at what goes on for the last few years of the war as well. So let's start off with the Battle of Saratoga. Historians refer to the Battle of Saratoga as the turning point of the Revolution, because up to this point, Britain has won most of the battles. They're still the heavy favorite to win the Revolution, and after the Battle of Saratoga, things change, and all of a sudden, the colonists have a much better shot of winning the Revolution. It's not guaranteed, but they have a much better shot than they did before. So after the Battle of Trenton, which is the last big battle we talked about, George Washington continued to try to avoid large battles with the British. You know, even though the Americans win at Trenton, and that helps, they still are no match for the British in an open battle. And so Washington continues to fight a defensive war. He retreats, and he is really just trying to wear out the British army. So rather than continue to try to chase Washington all over the place, the British come up with a plan to try to cut off or sever New England from the other colonies. Because they're still thinking, you know, New England is really where the problem started, and if we could just cut them off from the other colonies, hopefully we can end this thing. The plan involved having 3 different British armies meet up at Albany, New York. But it didn't work the way it was supposed to. General Howe, who was in New York City, he had captured New York City from Washington, he was supposed to move northward up towards Albany. But for some reason, and we're still not really 100% sure why, he went the other way. So he was supposed to go north, and he ends up going south, and he captures Philadelphia. There was a group of Indian allies that were supposed to help the British, and they didn't show up. And the British army that was coming from the west in New York got turned back. So that left 1 British army marching towards Albany instead of 3. So this map gives us a sense of kind of what we're talking about here. The red line to the left of the map that says St. Leger was 1 British army, and it was supposed to go east towards Albany. And as you can see, it started going that way, and then it ran into some colonial troops, and there were a couple of battles, and they got forced to turn around and go back. At the bottom of the map, you see an arrow that says to New York City. And you notice there's no red line right there because that's where General Howe was supposed to come up, and he never did. He went to Philadelphia instead. So that left the red line at the top of the map, General Burgoyne's army, as the only army that actually kept going to Albany. So he's marching there expecting to meet up with 2 other British armies, and it turns out that he's the only one that shows up. His army runs into a large force of American troops who were commanded by a guy named General Gates. And General Gates's American troops cut off the British. They cut off their escape route, and they cut off their access to their supplies, and they basically trap them. They fight several battles. The British try to hang on. They try to get away, but eventually the outnumbered British are forced to surrender. And General Burgoyne surrenders his whole army of 5,000 men in October of 1777. And here's the famous painting. There's actually a painting of this in the Capitol building in D.C. Of General Burgoyne surrendering to General Gates. So, okay, the Americans won a big victory. Why does this make it a turning point? Well, it has to do with Ben Franklin in France. Because Benjamin Franklin has been hanging out in France, trying and trying and trying really hard to get the French to come in and support the Americans. If you think back to the French and Indian War, the French have been looking for a chance to get revenge on England. And Benjamin Franklin is over there telling them, look, help us out, right? Get your revenge on England. But the French don't jump in right away because they're not sure that the colonists can win. They don't want to send a lot of troops and goods and spend a lot of money to help the colonists if they think it's a losing cause. So news of the victory at Saratoga gets to France, and Benjamin Franklin uses it to convince the French to come into the war and support the colonists. Right? He basically tells them, look, we captured an entire British army. See, we do have a shot to win. Come support us. Get your revenge on England and help us win our independence. And France finally agrees, and they send over desperately needed troops and ships and ammunition and money and supplies to help the Americans continue fighting the war and eventually win the war. So Saratoga, critical battle, turning point of the American Revolution because it brings the French into the war. So let's talk about the last few years of the war here and kind of sum up the fighting. So, as we just said, the victory at Saratoga, huge turning point, but it still wasn't the end of the war. Okay, there's still going to be several years of fighting. And even with the American victory, the British still controlled two of the most important cities, Philadelphia and New York. That winter, Washington's army had an absolutely miserable time camped out at a place called Valley Forge in Pennsylvania. They were running low on food and supplies, so men were starving and they were freezing in the camps. And Washington ended up losing 25% of his army to disease and exposure. Exposure meaning basically they're just out in the cold and they froze. And this painting here, famous painting of Washington's troops marching to Valley Forge, kind of gives you a sense of what they were dealing with, right? You notice it's cold, it's freezing, there's snow on the ground. If you look closely at the soldiers, several of them are bandaged up and walking on crutches. Several of them don't even have their legs all the way covered because their clothes are ripped. Some of them don't have shoes on their feet. So Washington's army was in a tough spot, right? And they were waiting on the French to send some supplies and help us out. But in the meantime, this was really a miserable winter. Despite this, though, there were some positives. While they were at Valley Forge, Washington kept training his troops. He said, look, we've got to keep working to get better. We need to be more disciplined. We need to be a stronger army. And despite the terrible conditions at Valley Forge, the army that comes out of Valley Forge was much better trained, much better disciplined than the army that went into Valley Forge. The French finally show up early in 1778, which helped out a ton in giving the colonists money to fight the war and supplies and troops. And not too long after Valley Forge, the Americans, who are much better trained at this point, win a big battle against the British at a place called Monmouth in June 1778. And that forces the British Army to shift its focus. So they stop fighting up in New York in New Jersey, and they say, all right, you know what? Let's go down into the South. Let's take the war to the South. So down in the South, there was some really fierce fighting. Both sides are winning some battles. If you've ever seen the movie The Patriot with Mel Gibson, this is kind of the area that's shown in the movie, that there's incredibly fierce fighting. And you had Americans who were patriots and loyalists who were fighting on both sides, right? So you actually had Americans fighting each other. And both sides are winning battles, but they're trading punches like two boxers in a ring. They just keep hitting each other and hitting each other, but neither side really seemed to be able to knock the other one out until the Battle of Yorktown. In 1781, the Americans and the French are finally able to get a knockout blow at Yorktown here in Virginia. And they do this by through the help of the French Navy. The British troops under a general named Cornwallis got themselves stuck in Yorktown, and they got themselves trapped between the French Navy out in the bay and the American Army on the land. So stuck between those two, Cornwallis holds on for a little while, but eventually he is forced to surrender. And that British surrender is effectively the last battle of the war. It ends the fighting.